and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, as per usual, big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, did the usual social media likes and things like that. Certainly seemed like Aaron enjoyed my review, and even though I probably wasn't totally complimentary about everything, they obviously took it in the way that the review was intended. So, like I said, a big thank you to everybody that shared it and liked it. It's very much appreciated. This week, before I go on, you may well have noticed that some of the videos do have adverts on them, and I will hasten to say that I have not monetarised my channel. You know, I'm not sort of for a few shekels wanting some kind of life insurance advert or something completely irrelevant to the show. But as you've seen, occasionally adverts do appear on episodes of the show, and that is because of the music. Obviously, all the music that I use on the show, although I'm free to use, is obviously copyrighted by the various publishing companies or what have you, and from time to time they will put a little claim on the video and monetize it, and it's kind of part and parcel of the game, I suppose. They're allowing people such as himself to use it for free, and but they're getting something out of it as well. It's a give and take situation, and if the artists that are creating the music that I'm using are gaining a little bit out of it, then brilliant. I've got no issue with that whatsoever. But like I said, I have no intention of monetarising and making money out of this channel. As you well know, I do it for the love of the spirit, and obviously, I am an opinionated person, so I like to get my opinions across. No, anyway. So, just thought I would just kind of clear that up for today. So, today's episode of the show is a little different. I fancied trying something other than whiskey, and as you know, I do enjoy a good rum. Yes, can we get that bit out of the way now? Thank you. I thought I've had this particular tasting lined up for quite a particular, quite some time really, but it's a case of trying to find the opportunity to shoehorn it in. And as you can see from the title page, we're looking at the Angostura Rum range from Trinidad and Tobago. Now, you may well know the range. They're probably more well known as a company for the Angostura bitters, and this is where the whole story starts. In 1820, a Dr. G.B. Seegert apparently developed this medicinal tonic. He was a field surgeon during the Napoleonic Wars, went on to enlist with General Simon Bolivar and his campaigns in South America, it sounds like he was quite an adventurer. Eventually he set up a military hospital in Venezuela and carried on perfecting well, I don't know what he called it at the time. I don't think he called it actually Angostura bitters, but he carried on attempting to perfect this particular tonic, shall we say. The rum bit doesn't kind of come in until a little bit later, until about 1875, when his sons decided to move the business from Venezuela, because it was all kicking off there. Ooh, kicking off in South America? Well, there's a novelty, isn't it? So they apparently moved to Trinidad and Tobago. Well, I suppose you would. I don't know, the weather's probably quite nice down there, so why not? As far as I believe, they began, well, so according to what I've read, making their own alcohol, but they didn't actually build the current distillery till 1949, so one assumes they sourced rum to use for the tonic they were making. And like I said, they eventually built their own distillery in 1949, And like most rum distilleries, it's not much of a looker, it has to be said. You know, most rum distilleries are more like factories than sort of cutesy Scottish distilling you know, places, distilleries. God. Yeah, I mean, they are damn big, and the Angostura, I don't know whether it's actually called the Angostura Distillery or not. I couldn't seem to find another name for it. As you well know, the rum industry is very much governed by brands, and you will often find that the distillery name generally never appears on them. So, I mean, take for example, Diplomatico is distilled at La Miel Distillery, and then you have the Diamond Distillery that produces El Dorado and various other things. So, I don't know whether it's actually called the Angostura Distillery, but the company is called the House of Angostura. So, I'm guessing it probably is. Anyway, so what they have is 5 column stills, each of which is actually colour coded. If you can find a picture of it, it's actually quite, well, pretty is probably not the right word, but interesting is probably the more apt. They so they use a molasses base, and they buy that in, they ferment it using their own proprietary yeast. Fermentation takes about 24 hours, so it's a fairly short fermentation. And here we get to the interesting part. As you well know, a lot of rum distilleries do tend to have multiple styles of stills, and then they will blend from these different distillates to create the various rums that they make in their portfolio. And obviously Angostura is no different. I mean, it obviously produces the Angostura range, but it also produces a range called Royal Oak, another one called Fernandez, VAT 19. These all tend to be sort of for consumption in and around the Caribbean. They also produce one called Black Label and another one called White Star. So, you know, these are all different blends, and you sort of think, well, how do they achieve that when all they've got is essentially one column still? Well, 5 columns. You see what I mean? Well, here's the interesting bit, because apparently they only use the distillate from the first column and the 5th column. So they produce what they call a heavy rum, which is obviously going to be full of esters and, you know, going to be quite intense from the first column. But by the time it's gone through the 5 columns, it will have softened, it will have been quite high toned. And I remember when I tasted these, all these samples, incidentally, apart from obviously this bottle, come from the 2015 World Rum Awards, and the only reason that the 15-year-old doesn't, because it hadn't been launched then, it was about another year it took before they launched that particular bottling. And so when you sort of sample these things blind, you apart from knowing the age range and the style of the spirit, you know nothing else. And so I've kind of got, I think, quite sort of used to picking out the characteristics of a column still rum over a pot still. But then even then you get thrown a curveball. I mean, for example, if you sort of go back to the video I did on Diplomatico, when I had the different still bottlings that they did. In actual fact, the column still bottling was actually quite heavier than what I was expecting. But then, of course, when you think about it, the column still has rectifying plates in it. So this is one of the things that you can do with a column still. You can add and subtract rectifying plates to make a heavier or a lighter spirit. And so they can, you know, if you go for a heavy spirit, you know, not too many rectifying plates, you can almost copy the style of spirit that comes out of a pot still. And so this is one of the wonderful things about column stills, is that they have this kind of flexibility. Anyway, yeah, like I said, basically, so the distillery produces a range which we will obviously get onto in due course, although I have no direct dealings with either the distillery itself or the distributors, Distel, so I can say whatever the hell I like. No, so basically, you know, this is a completely sort of like all my tastings. You know, I have, you know, no axe to grind or anything like that. What I tell it as it is. You know, and the one of the things that not perplexed, well no, perplexed is the wrong word, but one of the things I noticed, I guess, about their marketing and all this, it all seems to be revolving around cocktails. Now I know a lot of the rum scene is kind of dedicated to cocktails and all this sort of stuff, and I know from looking at their marketing they sponsor cocktail competitions and all this sort of thing, and it does kind of make you wonder. It's a case of, well, what are they trying to say about their product? Are they trying to say that their product is not good enough to stand alone, you know, or is it just a case of the younger spirits, like the 5-year-old and the 7-year-old, really aren't that complex enough to sort of warrant being, you know, anything other than a base for whatever the cocktail is? I mean, I'm you know me, I'm pure. I like my alcohol unadulterated by bits. But anyway, we'll obviously find that out when we get to the actual tasting, and yeah, I think this is going to be a bit of fun. So let's have a look at today's lineup. Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with the White Reserve. Now, this is not really sort of new make spirit. It's made in the style of Diplomatico, in that it sees 3 years aging in oak, which obviously rounds the thing off. Then obviously they centrifuge it to remove the colour, which I'm always feeling a little bit iffy about, it has to be said, because, you know, it's sort of, you know, anything like filtration and stuff like that is going to sort of remove some of the character of the spirit. But you know, I'm not making a judgment. I suppose the point is that not everybody is going to like pure white rum. I mean, it is essentially new make spirit at the end of the day, and you know, not all of it is you know, that easy to drink, shall we say. So by basically aging it for 3 years, it kind of rounds off the edges, takes some of the harshness away, and obviously adds a little bit of vanilla. So we shall see what that one is like. The second bottle we'll be looking at is incidentally, all of the range are bottled at 40%, which again I find a little bit disappointing. I would have liked to have seen the older age statements obviously unfiltered and bottled at 46%, but anyway, that is not the case. So this is the 5-year-old, bottled at 40%. Number 3 we'll be looking at is the 7-year-old, again bottled at 40%. The next bottling we'll be looking at, now this is where the range kind of diversifies. It goes from different styles of bottles. The labelling is different, and they start to get called given dates, which is interesting. So this is the 1919. Now it's possibly, from what I'm led to believe, 8-year-old spirit, and all of the dates on the last 3 bottlings have a resonance with either the company or the country, and apparently in 1919 has a resonance because in 1932, yeah, stick with me here on this one, there was a fire at the government bonded warehouse in Trinidad, and J.B. Fernandez, who was a rum blender whose company was, I believe, bought by Angostura, bought the salvaged casks, and what he discovered when he bought these casks, that all these casks had been distilled or been filled, shall we say, in 1919. Okay, interesting little story, I suppose, but that's the reason why this bottling is called the 1919. Penultimate bottling is the 1824, which I believe is 12 years old, and obviously 1824 is a date that's relevant to the company, because apparently this was the date that Dr. Siegert can't even can speak now, and I haven't even tasted any rum. Perfects, that's the word I was grasping for, or his Angostura bitters, or what I believe, I think they were called Amargo Aromatico at the time. I did make a note, I thought I'd made a note of what it was called originally. And the last bottling we'll be looking at is this one. This is the 15-year-old. This is the 1787 bottling, and apparently 1787 was the date of the first sugar factory that was built on the La Pérouse estate, which I'm assuming is the sugar plantation estate. And it's quite interesting in that another thing that does make Angostura slightly different is that the distillery wasn't actually part of a sugar plantation. A lot, as you well know, a lot of the rum distilleries were attached to a sugar plantation because it was basically a way of using up the sort of the leftover molasses and what have you from the sugar industry. But it would appear that Angostura was a distillery built purely for the distillation, and rather than being attached to a particular sugar plantation. So that's this week's lineup. Let's kick off with a bit of wine. Right, okay, so let's see what the nose gives us then, shall we? Light. It's got quite an earthiness in actual fact. There's a touch of vanilla, a little bit of dried fruit. It's got, for basically spending 3 years in oak, there is a sort of a new make slight rawness there, which is quite surprising. It's certainly nowhere near as kind of soft and vanilla'd as, say, the Diplomatico. I think this is actually quite appealing. It's certainly sort of, treads a nice line between sort of rawness and softness. There's a little bit of smokiness. There's, a nice raw sugar kind of note as well. It's, I think that's a really pleasant nose. I actually quite like that. See what palate's like. Ah, right, yeah, this is where we diverge a little bit. There's a lot more oak character on the palate, and I'm not really getting a lot of spirit character at all. It certainly doesn't have the earthiness or the slight rawness that was evident on the nose. It's very soft, it's very vanilla'd. There's a touch of spice on the finish. It's got a little bit of a kick to it, I suppose, but the palate is a lot less interesting than the nose, and that's a bit of a shame really, because I thought the nose was absolutely fantastic. It had a really great balance between the rawness of the spirit and the oak character. Unfortunately, on the palate, and this is often the case, a lot of spirits I tend to find, you will notice that the oak is more prevalent on the palate than it is on the nose on occasions, and this is certainly one of them. And not quite so keen on the palate on that, although nothing wrong with the quality of the spirit. Okay, so let's move on to the 5-year-old. So I'm guessing that we're going to be moving from light to heavy in characteristics, so I would imagine that pretty much most rum distilleries that utilise column stills, their youngest spirit will tend to have a lot more column still character. Because it's not so congenna heavy, it doesn't need to be aged for as long, and generally you will pick that up on the nose, and it's got a very neutral column still kind of nose to it. High tone, dried fruits, in the sort of the more kind of sultana, dried apricot kind of end of the spectrum. A little coffee. It's a little simplistic, and I often find that rums that, should we say, tend to be less than about 8 to 10 years old do tend to be relatively simplistic, and realistically they are there to be an element of a cocktail, shall we say. I mean, this is pleasant enough. I mean, there's no harshness. It's you could say it's a little bit dull, possibly. Anyway, let's see what passes on. Soft, oaky, toffeed, touch of dried fruit, a little bit of spice, unassuming, pleasant. It's you could quite happily drink that, but it's not sort of going to go make you go, oh, wow, that's. It's okay. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it whatsoever. I don't know what it retails for. I didn't actually check, but you know, the whole range I don't think is particularly excessively priced. I think the 15-year-old I think is only about 60 or 70 quid, which, when you think about a 15-year-old spirit these days, if you were talking whiskey, you'd be looking at 80 to 90 odd quid quite comfortably. So, you know, you can't argue. I think that the value for money element is certainly there. But, you know, the 5-year-old is what it is. You're not going to expect fireworks from a 5-year-old rum, and I must admit that, you know, certainly not a 5-year-old column still rum anyway. You may find this hard to comprehend. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 7-year-old. It's quite interesting that the gap between each, certainly, you know, early on is pretty minimal. You know, I mean, obviously, like I said, these are blends of, you know, column 5 and column 1, and they will be, you know, obviously different amounts used, and you know, obviously, actually quite a dark colour for an extra 2 years in the oak, it has to be said. It's deep. It's kind of a bit kind of four square, not as in the distillery, but as in chunky. There's a little bit more depth. There's a bit more oak, a bit more dried fruit, some spice. We're starting to move slightly into the sort of the raisinated fruit spectrum, as opposed to the sort of sultanery spectrum. There's a bit of toffee. Yeah, okay, it's got a little bit more going on than the 5-year-old, it has to be said, and it does kind of make you wonder why you would bother a couple of years more, and you are certainly getting a lot more on the nose. So the pass on. Coffee, dark toffee, a little bit of molasses, touch of spice, very rounded, very soft. Again, it's a bit, I mean, it's got a bit more, it's got obviously more depth, a little bit more oak character than the 5-year-old, but again, it's not a sort of a rum that's going to sort of set your pants on fire at the end of the day. It's okay. There's a little mentholated note, a little bit of chocolate, milk chocolate on the finish. Yeah, I mean, again, it's not an unpleasant rum at all. So far, you can see exactly where they're going with this. They're going for a very polished quality product, without too much kind of like edginess, or, you know, we're not talking Hampton here, you know. We're talking corporate style, which you could argue is maybe a bit corporate, but you know, this is what they've kind of set their stall out to do, and they are indeed doing it. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 1919 bottling. Like I said, I believe this is around about 8 years old, and similar-ish sort of colour to the 7, so could well be. Let's see what the nose gives us. A lot more oak, lot more vanilla, white chocolate, milk chocolate, quite oily as well, so I'm guessing a little bit more of column number 1 in this bottling. There is a little edginess just creeping in there, but again, we're definitely in the polished, soft, silky style of the earlier bottlings. There's a little bit of golden syrup, a little bit of mentholated herbal dried fruit. Again, okay, it's oh, I'm not going to rave about it, but again, it's a pleasant rum. See what it tastes like. Oh, a lot of oak, a lot of oak, a lot of sweet vanilla, almost kind of cloying finish. It's just, that really could have done with being at 43%, I personally think, because it is teetering on that sort of slightly cloying finishing note. White chocolate, again, milk chocolate, a little bit of raisinated fruit. I mean, as far as I'm led to believe that the distillery uses exclusively American oak, and you can tell on that. I mean, there is a high proportion, I would guess, of first fill bourbon in this particular bottling. It's very soft, it's very sweet in comparison to their earlier age statement bottlings. Certainly, like I said, not a post-distillation sweetness. This is definitely an oak caramel toffee sweetness, and I think that should have been bottled at a higher ABV to make that a little bit more of a successful bottling, personally. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 1824. This is the 12-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Is a nice nose. Again, we're getting, I think, more of column still number 1. It has a darker character. Cigar leaf, molasses, dark toffee, crystallized sugar, violets. Now that smells a lot older than 12 to me. There's a little bit of paraffin wax, earth. But again, it's got, I like this. I think this is again treading the line between very corporate and very polished style that the distillery has set out, with a little rough note just kind of, you know, there. It's got a nice balance to it, I think. And certainly so far, this is the most appealing of the bottlings. It's certainly got the most complexity, and like I said, I think the balance is really very, very good. See what the tastes like. Full, dense, spirit-driven. Obviously less first fill American oak. There's a little bitterness, a little bit of chocolate, dark chocolate, molasses, touch of spice, touch of toffee. Again, it's a nice balance of corporate and with a little edginess. Touch of wood spice. Is very, very long, and like I said, as far as I can see, this is the most successful bottling, and I think, you know, they've got the balance spot on. Again, I would like to have seen this bottled at a higher ABV. I don't think it's I don't think the 40% is as detrimental to this bottling as it is to the previous one, the 1919. But I really think when you're sort of starting to move into the premium, or is it super premium? I hate these marketing words. End of the rum spectrum, you really should be non-chill filtering, and you should be bottling at 46%. You know, really 40% at this kind of age and this kind of, you know, point really isn't, you know, where you should be, in my personal opinion. But I don't think that has really kind of hindered this particular bottling.
Infected every person you meet, the plans you made.
Right, okay, and so let's move on to the final bottling of the day. This is the 1787, the 15-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Crisp, fresh, more citric. Doesn't actually smell as old as the 12-year-old. This is kind of quite bizarre. It's got quite a high-toned column still freshness to it. Yeah, I mean, there's a mentholated note. There's again an edginess, and it's kind of moved away really from the kind of the style of the rest of the range, to be honest with you. I mean, in that it is really citric and really kind of crisp, and it doesn't kind of quite follow. I was expecting again a nice kind of blend of corporate and edginess, but it's kind of, it doesn't quite fit in. It's a bit weird, it has to be said. Yeah, it's kind of throwing a bit of a curveball in here, it has to be said. It doesn't really fit. It's a bit weird. It's almost as, I mean, I don't know who the master blender is at Angostura, but maybe this should have been bottled under some kind of different sort of label. You know, okay, if this is some kind of project that he wanted to do, or she, you know, maybe this should have been separated somehow from the range, because it really doesn't flow. It doesn't fit in with the style or the overall style of Angostura at all, personally. Anyway, let's see what the pass like. Yeah, like I said, the palate is exactly the same. It's more crisp, it's fresher, citric, menthol. There's a slight sort of crystallized violet note in the middle there, and there's a little bit of almost kind of paraffin. There's a bit of a bitterness on the finish as well, and there's not a huge amount of oak, and I'm starting to sort of look at this and think, look at the colour of that. Not getting a huge amount of oak. I'm guessing a lot of refill American oak casks. They're not really going to give you that level of colour, not refill casks, surely. I know the company basically states that they do not use caramel, but this has quite a bitterness on the finish, and you know, my caramel sensors are kind of going beep beep beep. Now I could be completely wrong. I could be that it is just the oak bitterness. It's the old oak bitterness possibly coming through, and I'm prepared to give it the benefit of the doubt on that. But I really don't see where this fits in. I mean, you know, to me, you can see a very clear lineage from the white through to the 12, and then suddenly you've got this kind of 15-year-old, which is just kind of weird in comparison. I mean, It's not a bad rum. It's interesting, and I think if it had been created as some kind of standalone kind of bottling, it may well have been. You could have understood that, it could be Blenders Select or some kind of thing like that, but it really doesn't seem to sort of flow at all with the rest of the range. Yeah. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. Really interesting. I love getting under the skin of a range of alcohol, whether it's whiskey or rum or what have you, because it just tells you so much about what the distillery or the company is trying to achieve and the image that they're trying to get across. And obviously Angostura are trying to get across a very corporate, polished, cocktail orientated, fun, funky vibe. They're not sort of aiming at the sort of rum aficionados, or maybe that's what they're trying to do with the 15-year-old. But like I said, I think it kind of doesn't kind of work in the overall range. The white is quite pleasant. I loved the nose. I thought the nose was really good. The palate less interesting. It was just a little bit too much oak. Again, I would personally just sort of dispense with the oak. Just go for, if you're going to be using, fair amount of, say, column still number 5, it's going to be quite highly rectified anyway. So you're not going to get too much funkiness. Just forget about the oak on that one personally. The 5-year-old is what it is. It's a cocktail ingredient. It's pretty straightforward, a bit dull. And the 7-year-old, you can probably argue, is exactly the same. It's got a little bit more character, a little bit more depth than the 5-year-old. But again, I really struggle to find rums that are less than about 8 to 10 years old that are really sort of that interesting. A lot, like I said, they are blending fodder or cocktail fodder, as the case may be. The 1919, I really thought that was actually the I wouldn't say the worst bottling, but the less interesting bottling. Too much oak, too much sweetness, a little bit unbalanced, lacking the alcohol to kind of like offset that sweetness. I can see exactly why they've done that particular bottling, but like I said, really that should have been bottled at 43 or 46%. The 12-year-old, like I said, I think that is kind of the star bottling within the Angostura range. It really does seem to be where it all kind of comes together really pleasantly. Yes, again, I would argue that should have been bottled at 46% and shouldn't have been filtered, and you may well have had a world-class product. I know they all win bloody awards and medals and gongs and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, from a purist's point of view, the 12-year-old is really the only bottling in this whole range that really is worth going for. And the 15, by all means, make your own mind up. Like I said, this is just my personal opinion. It doesn't work in the range. It certainly doesn't follow the pattern. It's a bit sort of, left of centre, but not left of centre in enough of a kind of weird kind of left of centre way, if you follow my logic on this one. If you're going to make something that's a bit kind of weird and wonderful, create it as a standalone product rather than kind of shoehorning it into your range, because it does not fit in there whatsoever. And there is a little kind of breaking down of the spirit on the finish, it has to be said, and it does ask the question that is 15 a little bit too long in the tooth for Angostura? Should they really basically say, look, 12-year-old is the point of where our spirit is at point, and this is what we should be focusing on, and 15 is where we're starting to get a little bit, And I don't think that the Angostura spirit really would last long. I mean, you would not expect to see a 40-year-old Angostura or something of that kind of ilk. It would have completely broken down and sort of be kind of like, you know, battling against each other, you know, in my personal opinion. So, so yeah, there you have it. That's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I will say this about next week's episode of the show. I do know what I'm doing, and you do not want to miss this, because this is a show that I think is, well, I've been thinking about doing it for a long time, and it is going to be really interesting. That's all I can say. So you better tune in next week, as I say. But anyway, thanks for watching this week's episode of the show. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you'll at least go and try the 12-year-old, because the 12-year-old is bloody good. So until next week, all I have to say is good afternoon and good ramming.